Our next speaker, his landmark research over the past few years has separated fact from fiction in the net neutrality debate, examined the state of broadband competition in America, wrote about expanding the role of the Universal Service Fund for the 21st century, and exposed the shocking lack of radio and television stations owned by women and people of color. If it wasn't for him, I would never remember what HHI stands for. I'd like to turn things over to Derek Turner, Research Director of Free Press. Please give it up for Derek.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a good time so far. It's been 1 year since we gathered here last, 1 year since I stood up here and laid out a brief history of U.S. internet policymaking and explained how the FCC, in just a few short years, through a series of misguided deregulatory decisions, unraveled Congress's vision of competition law and 40 years of its own successful policymaking. But my message a year ago was actually one of cautious optimism for the future, because we were on the verge of a new day with new leadership at the FCC, one with the wind of Congress at its back, demanding an action plan to solve our nation's broadband problems. And a lot has happened over the past year. We've seen the broadband stimulus program get underway, with much-needed funds going to rural areas and anchor institutions like schools and libraries. A rulemaking has begun at the FCC on the open internet, and of course, we now have a national broadband plan. But though the national broadband plan is unprecedented in its scope and how it was put together, I'm afraid, as far as plans go, it's a mile wide, but just 3 inches deep. So here, a year later, I think my assessment has gone from cautious optimism to tempered frustration. As a consumer advocate, I'm frustrated because though we have heard a lot of talk about action coming out of this FCC, we don't yet have any results or much of a change in policy. As a consumer advocate, I'm frustrated because when I look at the National Broadband Plan, I see one giant missed opportunity. One where the FCC took a pass on the chance to implement transformative change and undo much of the damage done by the prior FCC. By asking for a national broadband plan, Congress wrote the FCC a huge check for political capital, and unfortunately, the FCC chose not to spend it. The undeniable fact, confirmed by the broadband plan's analysis, is that we today have a strong cable telco duopoly and an emerging cable modem monopoly. The FCC's own data shows that 96% of consumers have 2 or fewer choices for wired broadband. And though the broadband plan emphasizes wireless, the realities of the market and technology indicate that there is no reason to think that wireless, even next-generation wireless technology, is going to change that. But the National Broadband Plan just whistles past this competition graveyard. Case in point, in crafting the plan, successful competition policies used in Western Europe and East Asia were preemptively taken off the table before any analysis had even begun. A decision motivated not by empirical realities, but only by a sheer unwillingness to advocate for any competition policies that might raise the ire of the powerful phone and cable incumbents. But my disappointment and missed opportunity aside, the plan does move the ball forward in many ways. And there are plenty of important recommendations about universal service, data, transparency, privacy, and disabilities access that, if implemented, will make the market work better for consumers. However, in the wake of the Comcast v. FCC decision by the D.C. Circuit Court, the Commission's authority to act in the broadband arena has been called into question. But this decision finally forced Chairman Janikowski to directly confront the mistakes of his predecessors. Mistakes that took broadband, the communications medium of the 21st century, out from under direct oversight authority of the Federal Communications Commission. But in the debate of what the FCC's next step should be, it seems that many have lost the thread of history, placing adjectives like radical onto the framework Congress established for our nation's two-way communications networks. Like many of our nation's major laws, our Communications Act is guided by basic enduring principles. The principles of universal service, non-discrimination, interconnection, technological advancement, competition, and reasoned deregulation. These principles, embodied in Title II of the 1996 Act, were intended to foster the development of a robust, advanced, and competitive two-way communications market. This is why the current heated debate over broadband's place in Title I or Title II seems so odd when viewed in the context with the Communications Act itself. Of course, two-way broadband transmission networks belong in Title II because that's where Congress put them and intended them to stay. But that does not mean that Congress intended for a permanent heavy hand of regulation to apply to these advanced networks. Again, Congress recognized that as competition develops, reasoned deregulation is an appropriate response. The act provided forbearance as the path of reasoned deregulation for our nation's two-way networks. However, FCC Chairman Michael Powell chose a different path to deregulation, a path where the FCC achieved deregulation by redefining broadband services such that they no longer fell under the agency's authority. Mr. Powell and later Chairman Martin felt that they could follow this path to deregulation while preserving the Commission's ability to uphold the Act's other principles. But the Title I legal theory they based this assumption on has now been proven to be unworkable. In other words, Powell and Martin's legal interpretations physically broke the law, making it unworkable except through their ancillary authority theory, a theory that is now defunct because of the Comcast ruling. Facing this reality, if the FCC wishes to implement the National Broadband Plan and protect the open internet, reclassification is not only the sole viable option available to the FCC, it's the option most in line with the stated intent of Congress. Reclassification puts the Commission's rules back in harmony with the law, and when coupled with the FCC's proposed forbearance, simply preserves today's deregulatory status quo. And while we as consumer advocates are glad the FCC is poised to reclassify, we're not so sure we should be cheering a march towards the status quo. The dissatisfaction with the status quo is why Congress asked for a national broadband plan in the first place. The status quo is one where we pay far too much for far too little, with rates rising, relative investment levels declining, and the internet's openness increasingly under threat. The status quo is unfettered market power in the hands of the duopoly. This is clearly not the outcome Congress envisioned when it overhauled the Communications Act 15 years ago. Congress established a framework for both competition and deregulation in two-way networks, one that aimed to ensure adequate competition was in place before deregulation occurred. In other words, Congress aimed to ensure the free market was actually free. You see, this point is often lost in today's DC policy debates. There is actually a very big difference in practice between being pro-free market and between being pro-big business. But don't just take my word for it. Go look at the congressional record, at the hearings, at the statements. Go ask the leaders who crafted the act in a bipartisan fashion, like our next guest here today, Senator Byron Dorgan, who played a very strong role in trying to ensure the new legislation actually had some teeth to it when it came to ensuring competition was actually in place before deregulation. While the act was being drafted, Senator Dorgan said, quote, "If our goals are to ensure that consumers receive advanced telecommunications and media services at competitive prices and to free the industry from government regulation, competition is our means to that end. But it must be true and fair competition. Competition works in a free market when the market is free," end quote. Now, he's here with us today, and I know his position on this matter has not wavered one bit in the past 15 years. And this kind of unwavering commitment to the basic principles that serve as the foundations of our nation's laws is just one of many qualities that define Senator Byron Dorgan's public service. His commitment to competition is matched by his tireless efforts on behalf of rural consumers. He's been a leader working to ensure that they are not left on the wrong side of the digital divide. In this day and age, consumers just don't have many reliable champions left on the Hill. And Senator Dorgan is one of those champions who have for years fought for consumer interest and has done so in a bipartisan manner. He has a long record of fighting media consolidation and is a hero for internet freedom as the Senate's leading advocate for open internet policy. Now, in a bit of sad news, the Senator announced his retirement from this great deliberative body at the end of this term. But those of us who share his beliefs in the principles of fairness, non-discrimination, real competition, and the transformative and democratizing power of the internet will continue to work with him to uphold these principles while he's still on the job, and we will work even harder to uphold his legacy through these principles far into the future. We're so very fortunate to have him here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Senator Byron Dorgan.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see all of you today. I am from a town of 300 people in southwestern North Dakota, wheat and ranching country. High school senior class of 9 students, top 5. And I found my way to the United States Congress, where I have served for 3 decades. And it's a great gift to serve here, but it is also the opportunity, it seems to me, to do other things in life after 3 decades here in the Congress. And so I'm going to do that. But let me say to you, these 3 decades for me have been about trying to understand how you determine what is in the public interest. What is in the public interest? We've forgotten that lesson from time to time. And as America has grown and we see concentration in almost every area of our lives concentration of industries and businesses and so on, the private interest trumpets, or rather trumps, I should say, the public interest all too often. I spoke with the oldest woman in North Dakota about a year or so ago. She died a couple of months ago. Her name was Mary McCarthy, and she was 111 years old. And I was invited to her birthday party on the 110th birthday of Mary in Grand Forks, North Dakota. But I wasn't able to go to her birthday, so I was traveling somewhere else that weekend. And so the next time I was in Grand Forks, I stopped by to see Mary. And she was wonderful. Her niece was there, by the way, who put on her birthday party. Her niece was 103. And I talked to Mary about the recollections of 111 years, the span of a century of life. What is it she has seen? You know, television, telephone, internet, I mean, just everything, transportation, and in virtually every single area. And I was thinking about the internet and its role in her life. And I have a 90-year-old uncle, by the way, who just finished taking classes on the computer and is now very active on the internet. That's not unusual for him because he's also a runner in the Senior Olympics, and he has 43 gold medals. At age 90, he runs the 100 meters in just under 19 seconds. So my uncle has just taken computer lessons. Why? Because at age 90, the internet's something he wants to be involved in. He wants to understand what this means in his life. And it's true all over this country that the internet has had a profound impact on our lives. And the question is, what about the public interest with respect to the internet? I have often gone to town meetings where we have people show up these days and they read from the internet that the talking points that they're supposed to raise at town meetings. What in the hell has government ever done right? Name one thing. They've created a Social Security system that's led this country down the path of socialism. They've created a Medicare system that's breaking the bank. They can't even run the postal system. They just read it off. It's a rip and read off the internet, as you know. And so I start by saying, well, how about maybe the internet? How about the internet? That was developed by the federal government. Developed by the federal government. And oh, by the way, I would say to Grover Norquist and his friends, who apparently this morning had a press conference and said the approach by the Federal Communications Commission is a designed attempt to have a government takeover of the internet. I would remind them that, of course, not only is that not the case at all, but the internet was begun by the federal government, and it was created and the architecture developed, and the flowering of the internet was allowed to happen under rules that had the non-discrimination requirement right in the rules. So that always existed up until Chairman Powell decided, I don't want that to happen anymore. And what he did is he redescribed down at the Federal Communications Commission the internet policies and switched that to information service, as you're well aware, and as a result, the non-discrimination rules vanished. Our determination to recreate the non-discrimination rules is not an attempt at a government takeover of the internet. It is this allegation is another part of the big lie that so permeates public policy these days. The health care bill we just passed, the big lie was, this is a government takeover of health care. Nothing could be further from the truth. I just spent an hour this morning on the subject of the estate tax. And the estate tax, as you know, Frank Luntz, the pollster, provided one political party with the message on the estate tax, call it a death tax. And that became the big lie. There's no such thing as a tax on death. There's a tax on inherited wealth, which is quite a difference, isn't it? But the big lie these days is those of us who care about trying to make sure the internet remains open and free, and the internet is not controlled and managed by the increasingly larger companies that through mergers become larger every single year, it is not a government takeover of the internet. I happen to believe in the free market system. I think it makes a lot of sense. But the free market system, as an allocator of goods and services while having great merit, also needs a referee. Someone with a striped shirt and a whistle that blows the whistle when they see the fouls. And there are plenty of fouls. Some say, well, there's no need to reclassify the internet at all. I mean, the information service is fine. The fact there's not a non-discrimination rule doesn't matter very much because Nobody's doing anything bad out there. Well, a local phone company was caught blocking VoIP services. That was the fact. And a wireless company blocked political text messages because they deemed them too controversial. And we well know that Comcast was secretly blocking BitTorrent, an incident that led to the court decision earlier this year. So the question is, what happens now? And as a result of the court decision, what does the FCC do? Now, let me just, as I talk about the FCC quickly and the chairman, let me tell you, and maybe I told some of you at another conference, about walking into my old boyhood home in my town of 300 people. I hadn't been there for a long time, and I knocked on the front door of this little two-bedroom white home, and the woman that answered knew me, of course, from my old hometown, and I said, would you mind if I take a look at the house I grew up in? She said, of course, I'd be happy to. And she walked me through the porch and into the kitchen. And in the kitchen, she had a camera on a little stanchion, and then she had a little aperture where there was a gold bracelet hanging, and she was taking a photograph of the gold bracelet. I said, what are you doing here? She said, well, I have a business. I said, what's your business? Well, I sell jewelry on the internet. Really? Yeah. She said, and I said that when I came through the porch, there were boxes and tape. Is that what that is? Yeah. She said, that's my packing department. This woman, in a little town of 300 people, can reach the world. Her site on the internet can reach the entire world. Now the question is, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will she be able to reach the world? Or will she need to pay somebody, just a small token perhaps at first, and then a little more later when she becomes successful? Will she be able to access the world on the internet, or will someone else decide exactly what kind of access she has? And that's the issue here. That's the fight. We've seen the development of unbelievable companies hatched in the minds of some unbelievable people. In a dorm room, Sergey and Larry decide that in a dorm room they're going to start a company. And the company, of course, is Google. And think of this now, 1998, they moved to a garage because the garage had a garage door opener. And they had 8 employees, and the ability to open the door was kind of nice for a temporary office. That was 1998. Think of the size of that company not very many years later. Why? Because they had an idea and they had access to the entire world. And the question is, will that continue? Now, back to the FCC. Julius Janikowski is the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and he's trying to undo an unbelievable amount of damage that was done over the last 8-9 years by an FCC that said, you know what, let's just deregulate everything, let's not watch, let's not look, whatever happens, happens. It'll be fine. You can't do that when there's not competition. The only way you could ever do that is if there is robust competition in any area. But when there is not competition, and believe me, there is not around this country, in my state, most of the people have access to either 1 or 2 broadband providers. That's just a fact. And so without that competition, you can't decide as regulators you're not going to look. I also spent part of the morning in the Senate working on an amendment of mine that would ban what I called naked credit default swaps in the financial services industry. Now, I know you're asking the question, how does a credit default swap get naked? Well, a credit default swap, which is new language for all of us, is an insurance policy against a bond default. But a naked swap is when 2 other people bet against that bond default, having no insurable interest in the bond. It's just a wager. It's not an investment. It's the sort of thing you used to do in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Now you do it inside banking institutions, and the American taxpayer picks up the bill when you lose your shirt. So I want to ban naked credit default swaps. It's not radical to suggest that you should have no more insurance policies insuring bonds than there are bonds to insure. But you should see the apoplectic seizure that exists on Capitol Hill today over my amendment. Every single investment bank and banking interest is out very, very upset about it. Your organization, Free Press, and others that you represent have been the most tireless advocates for the kind of public policy that is necessary for us going forward. And I appreciate that. As you know, in this town and around the country, there are plenty of interests the larger economic interests that have plenty of resources to make their case about what they want. And what they want is complete, total deregulation. They don't want anybody looking over their shoulder. They don't want anybody calling the fouls. They want deregulation. I want appropriate federal government regulation where it is necessary. And in this area, it certainly, in my judgment, is necessary. It is not a government takeover. It is just effective regulation. What I have asked Chairman Janikowski to do in letters and in other ways is to go back and reclassify. Mike Copps and I wrote a joint op-ed piece suggesting that it go back and be reclassified under Title II. Chairman Janikowski has, I think, defined what he's described as a third way. That itself is causing a seizure among some in town, as I indicated at a press conference today, calling it the government takeover of the internet. That's completely and totally absurd. So I think the role for all of us is to just decide we're going to keep fighting here. And it's not just this. It is every radio station in every community, every television station, the whole area of communications in our lives. What has happened to the public interest? The public interest requirements that always used to exist. It's unbelievable how far away we've gotten from the public interest on these issues. You've got a radio license, you want to get an extension, send a postcard in. You don't have to demonstrate anymore. You know, that you used to have to demonstrate you were serving at the public interest and what you were doing for local folks. You don't have to do that. We need to come back and change all of that to reinstall a public interest requirement in all of these areas. And the sooner we do that, the better. Let me say, I've got to be back for a 1 o'clock caucus in the Senate today, so I'll be mercifully brief and tell you one final thing. Although I believe in government regulation and I believe in the capabilities and the promise of good government, otherwise I wouldn't serve. I serve with a lot of people who don't like government, frankly. I've never understood why they desire to come to government and really don't like it very much. But I believe in the promise of good government. And I do think that if all of us work together to try to find the right kind of regulatory oversight and so on, that we will have a much better future. But having said all that, sometimes the government, it's big and it's unwieldy and it's bureaucratic and it drives me crazy, as I'm sure it does you from time to time. And some long while ago, I found out that in the basement of the Pentagon, they had created and had spent $10 million already on a system by which they would develop a futures contract on items of intelligence so that you could actually, American people could make wagers. What's the likelihood of the president of Jordan being assassinated within the next 12 months? How many soldiers do you bet that we will lose to war in the next 12 months? Just to give you an example of the things you could buy a futures contract on, and then you could either win or lose money. When I found out about that, I said, that can't possibly be happening. And I discovered, in fact, it was, and within 30 days it was going to be operational. And if they could get people betting on these Byzantine things, they would be able to garner intelligence from them. Is that unbelievable? So I held a press conference with Senator Wyden, and we disclosed this, and the Secretary of Defense said, I've never heard of it. The President of the United States, George Bush, said, never heard of it. And meanwhile, the guy that created it apparently told the Secretary and the President what he was creating, and they fired him, and so that was the end of it. But at my press conference, I'm a Lutheran Norwegian, at my press conference I said that this was unbelievably stupid, which is really an overstatement for a Lutheran Norwegian. Unbelievably stupid. So about 4 months later, one of my really smart, tech-savvy, computer-savvy, internet-savvy staffers came to me and said, I found something really interesting. I typed in under Google, unbelievably stupid, and Byron Dorgan came up. True story. It almost at that point led me to believe that the internet had no value. But I've actually been able to overcome that impulse. And let me also say to you, as we continue down this road, your continued fight, your continued energy is really important because the other side is at this. They believe, and Julius Janikowski, the FCC, they really need our help. They need our support. And, you know, letters to the editor, the kinds of op-ed pieces and so on, every part of this country, go at it hard and fight back, because the big lie ought not work in this case. And what we do here, if we're able to be successful, will have an impact in this country for decades to come, saying that we believe the architecture of an open and free internet is that which will create the best innovation and the best in this country. So, and that'll come through effective regulatory oversight by the Federal Communications Commission. Thank you very much for your work.